It all started a few years ago when I was still in high school. I grew up in this small, boring town in Ohio, not too far from Cincinnati. There wasn't much to do, especially for a bunch of teenagers. Most nights we'd just hang out in someone's basement, play video games, or sneak a few beers. So when Halloween rolled around that year, my friends and I were trying to figure out something different to do. It was one of those cool, crisp October nights. The leaves had all turned, the air smelled like bonfires and pumpkins, and it felt like the perfect night to get into some trouble. That's when we got the idea to check out this old house on the outskirts of town. You know the kind of place I'm talking about. Every town has one. The house that everyone says is haunted or cursed or whatever. Ours was this run-down two-story place sitting on the edge of the woods. It had been abandoned for years. Paint peeling off the sides, windows boarded up, just the kind of place you wouldn't want to get caught around after dark. The thing is, no one really knew why it was abandoned. It wasn't like anyone in town could remember a family living there. No tragic fire or murder story was attached to it, which made it weirder somehow. It just stood there, decaying, while the rest of the town carried on like it didn't exist. You'd hear the usual rumors about squatters or maybe drug addicts using it as a place to crash, but nothing too crazy. A few kids would dare each other to go inside, but no one ever did. At least, not until that night. There were 3 of us. Me, my best friend Matt, and his cousin Greg, who was staying with him for a few months. Greg was the one who pushed the idea. He'd heard about the house from Matt, and since he wasn't from around here, he didn't have the same kind of respect for the place that we all did. He wanted to prove it was just an old building and nothing more. So after some back and forth, we agreed to check it out. We rode our bikes out there, parking them in the woods a little ways from the house so no one would see them if they happened to drive by. Not that anyone would be out on that road at night anyway. It was pretty remote. The only reason you'd go that way was if you were lost or you lived out in the woods, and I don't think anyone did. The house stood at the end of this long gravel driveway. There weren't any other houses around, just thick woods stretching out behind it. We brought flashlights, of course. I'm not sure what we thought we'd find inside, but the 3 of us weren't about to wander into a pitch-black house without some kind of light. As we got closer, the place looked even worse than I remembered. The roof sagged in places, and the front door was barely hanging on its hinges. We had to shove it open, and the wood creaked loudly as we stepped inside, like the house was groaning from being disturbed after so many years. The first floor was pretty much what you'd expect from an abandoned house. Broken furniture, garbage scattered around, a couple of old beer bottles that probably came from kids who had the same idea as us, but chickened out before going any deeper. The place smelled musty, like wet wood and mildew with just a hint of something worse, like something had died in there a long time ago. We started exploring room by room. The living room had an old couch that was falling apart, and the kitchen was disgusting, with dirty dishes still piled in the sink, like whoever left had done so in a hurry. There were rat droppings everywhere, and I nearly stepped on a dead mouse at one point. Greg kept making jokes to lighten the mood, but I could tell he was just as creeped out as Matt and I were. Then we found the basement door. It was in the back of the kitchen, partially hidden behind a curtain. The door itself was locked, which was strange because the rest of the house seemed so easy to get into. Greg, being Greg, immediately started messing with the lock, trying to pry it open with a screwdriver he'd found in one of the drawers. Matt and I weren't sure we wanted to go down there, but Greg wasn't the type to give up easily. After a few minutes of working at it, he managed to pop the lock and the door creaked open, I remember feeling a wave of cold air hit me as we stared down into the basement. Our flashlights didn't do much to cut through the darkness, but we could see the top of a narrow staircase leading down. The walls were concrete, and the air smelled damp, like the basement had flooded at some point. Greg was already heading down before Matt or I could say anything. The stairs groaned under our weight, and I kept thinking one of them was going to snap, sending us tumbling down into the dark. But we made it to the bottom, and that's when things started to get really weird. The basement was bigger than I expected, and unlike the rest of the house, it wasn't trashed. In fact, it looked like someone had been living down there recently. There was an old mattress in one corner, covered in dirty blankets. Empty cans of food were scattered around, along with a few plastic water bottles. There was even a stack of newspapers, though they were yellowed with age. But the creepiest part? The walls were covered in photographs, dozens of them. Most were old, black and white shots of people, but some were more recent, like they'd been taken with a Polaroid camera. They were all of kids. Some looked like they were from the 1950s or earlier, while others seemed more recent, maybe even from our time. The more I looked, the more I realized I recognized some of them. One in particular stood out. It was a picture of a girl from our school who had gone missing a couple of years earlier. Her face was front and center, staring directly into the camera. At this point, my stomach was in knots, and I could tell Matt was freaking out too. Greg, on the other hand, seemed fascinated. He was rifling through the newspapers trying to find a date or something, but I couldn't focus. All I wanted to do was leave. The whole place felt wrong, like we had walked into something we weren't supposed to see. That's when we heard it. Upstairs, the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate. They echoed through the empty house, and for a second, none of us moved. We were frozen in place, listening as the footsteps got closer. Someone was inside the house. I could hear them moving from room to room, their steps slow and methodical, like they were searching for something. Or someone. Without saying a word, we all looked at each other and bolted for the basement window. It was small, barely big enough for us to squeeze through, but we weren't about to head back upstairs with whoever was up there. I went first, pushing myself through the narrow opening and landing hard on the cold, wet grass outside. Matt followed, and then Greg. We didn't stop running until we were back at our bikes, hidden in the woods. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. Once we reached the safety of the trees, we crouched down, catching our breath and trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. We waited for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, we saw someone leave the house. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like old work clothes. He didn't have a flashlight or anything, but he moved with purpose, like he knew the house inside and out. He didn't look around or try to find us. He just walked out of the front door, got into an old truck parked at the end of the driveway, and drove off into the night. We waited until we were sure he was gone before grabbing our bikes and riding back to town as fast as we could. None of us spoke the whole way back. We didn't stop until we were in Matt's basement, the three of us sitting in a circle trying to process what we'd just seen. We never told anyone about what happened. Not our parents, not our friends. We just pretended like it never happened, like we'd never gone to that house in the first place. But the pictures on those walls, especially the one of that missing girl from our school, I couldn't get it out of my head. I started paying closer attention to the news, looking for any mention of missing kids or strange happenings in our town. but nothing came up. The house is still there. I pass it sometimes when I'm driving out that way, and every time I feel a chill run down my spine. We never went back, and I don't plan to. But sometimes late at night, when I'm trying to fall asleep, I think about that man. Whoever he was, whatever he was doing in that house, I have a feeling we weren't the first ones to stumble into his basement, and I doubt we'll be the last. This happened in 2022, right before Halloween. I was living in Indianapolis at the time, in a one-bedroom apartment that was part of an old Victorian house. The whole neighborhood had a kind of charm, with its narrow streets, big trees, and old houses that had been turned into apartments over the years. It wasn't the best part of town, but the rent was cheap, and I liked the vintage feel of the place. The only downside was that it was a bit too quiet at night, especially for a single woman living alone. I moved there after finishing grad school and landing my first real job in the city. It wasn't my dream job, but it was a start, and I was grateful for the opportunity. I'd always been a pretty independent person, so living on my own didn't bother me at first. In fact, I liked it. It was peaceful, and I didn't have to deal with roommates or anyone else invading my space. I had my routine: work during the day, come home, maybe watch some TV or read, then go to bed. Most nights were pretty uneventful, and that's how I liked it. The building itself was old and a bit run down, like most of the houses in that part of town. My apartment was on the first floor, with big windows facing the street and a small front porch. The front door had one of those heavy brass locks and a chain, but it always felt a bit flimsy to me. I'd noticed early on that some of the windows didn't lock properly, and the back door had a screen door that barely latched. I tried not to think about it too much, telling myself I'd get it fixed eventually. But living alone, especially as a woman, you get used to being a bit paranoid. I double-checked the locks every night and kept a baseball bat under my bed just in case. I told myself I was being cautious, not paranoid. The neighborhood wasn't exactly known for being dangerous, but there had been a few break-ins over the past year, and I figured it didn't hurt to be careful. Anyway, that Halloween fell on a Wednesday, and since I didn't have many friends in the city yet, I didn't have any big plans. I just started dating someone casually, but it was too new for us to spend the holiday together. He had mentioned something about a work party, and I figured I'd just stay in, hand out some candy to the trick-or-treaters, and watch a few movies. It was one of those cool, crisp autumn nights. The leaves had all turned, and the air smelled like wood smoke and fallen leaves. You could hear kids running up and down the street, laughing and shouting as they went door to door in their costumes. I handed out candy for a while, but after about 9:30, it started to slow down. By 10 o'clock, the street was quiet, and I figured the night was over. I turned off the porch light, locked the front door, and settled into bed with a movie on my laptop. I wasn't particularly tired, but it had been a long week at work, so I figured I'd try to get some rest. I scrolled through my phone for a bit, half watching the movie, and eventually started to drift off. It must have been close to midnight when I first heard the knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just a soft, almost polite knock, like someone who didn't want to disturb me. At first, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. After all, it was late, and I'd already turned off the light outside. There was no reason for anyone to be at my door. But then it came again, a little louder this time. A steady knock, knock, knock. I sat up in bed, my heart starting to race a little. Who would be knocking at this time of night? My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Someone was trying to break in, or maybe it was some drunk person who had stumbled onto my porch by mistake. Either way, I wasn't about to open the door without checking who it was first. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and tiptoed out of the bedroom, trying to make as little noise as possible. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow from the streetlights outside. I could see the outline of the front door in the dim light, but I didn't dare get too close just yet. Instead, I crept over to the small peephole in the door and leaned in, my breath catching in my throat as I looked out. There, standing on my front porch, was a man. He was wearing a plain white mask, the kind you could buy at any party store for a couple of bucks. It wasn't a scary mask, not one of those horror movie kinds, but there was something about it that felt off. The mask was completely expressionless, with empty black eye holes that stared straight ahead. He wasn't wearing a costume, just a dark hoodie and jeans. In his hand, he was holding a cheap plastic trick or treat bucket, the kind you'd expect to see a little kid carrying. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who was this guy? And why was he out trick-or-treating at midnight? For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring at him through the peephole, hoping he'd leave. But he didn't. He just stood there, perfectly still, like he was waiting for something. Then, without warning, he knocked again, this time harder, more insistent. My mind was racing. Should I open the door? Should I call the police? I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to just ignore him, hope he'd go away on his own. But another part of me was terrified that if I didn't do something, he might try to break in. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. I quickly locked the deadbolt and latched the chain just to be safe. Then I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling as I typed in the numbers. The operator picked up almost immediately, and I explained what was happening in a hushed voice, trying to stay calm. I told her about the man at my door, about the mask and the bucket, and how he was just standing there knocking. She asked if I could see him, and I told her I was looking through the peephole. She told me to stay on the line and stay where I was, that the police were on their way. But then, just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, the knocking stopped. For a second, I thought maybe he had left, but then I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving away from the door and around the side of the building. I felt my stomach drop. My apartment had a side door, one that led to a narrow alley between my building and the house next door. It wasn't as secure as the front door, and I rarely used it. But now, I realized with horror that the man was heading straight for it. I ran to the kitchen, trying to stay quiet as I peeked out of the small window that faced the alley. The streetlight cast long shadows down the narrow space, but I could just make out the shape of the man as he walked slowly toward the side door. He wasn't in any hurry. He wasn't running or panicking. He was calm, methodical, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I quickly turned off the kitchen light and ducked down, hiding behind the counter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto my phone. I whispered into the receiver, telling the operator what was happening, that he was heading for the side door. She kept telling me to stay calm, that the police were almost there, but it didn't feel like they were coming fast enough. Then I heard it. The side door rattled. He was testing the handle, trying to see if it would open. I held my breath, praying that the flimsy deadbolt would hold. The door shook again, harder this time, as if he was trying to force it open. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the phone to my chest, listening to the sound of the door creaking under the pressure. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. There was a long, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I stayed crouched behind the counter, too scared to move, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No footsteps, no knocking, no rattling, just silence. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. I stayed where I was, too afraid to move, until I heard the knock at the front door. This time, it wasn't the soft, eerie knock of the man in the mask. It was a heavy, authoritative knock. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole once again, and this time I saw the flashing lights of a police cruiser parked outside. I unlatched the chain, unlocked the door, and opened it just a crack, enough to see the officer standing on my front porch. I told him what had happened, about the man in the mask and how he'd tried to get in through the side door. They searched the area, but found no trace of him. It was like he had just vanished. That night haunted me for a long time. In 2021, I was living in Milwaukee. I had just moved into a new apartment with my girlfriend, Sarah, and we were both pretty excited about it. It was one of those big brick buildings that had been converted from an old factory into lofts, so it had that cool, industrial vibe. High ceilings, exposed pipes, big windows. The building was located in the Walker's Point neighborhood, which is pretty well known for its restaurants, bars, and a kind of artsy scene. We loved it. We'd only been there a couple of months when Halloween rolled around, and since it was our first one in the new place, we decided to throw a little party. Nothing huge, just some close friends, a few drinks, and maybe some Halloween games or a horror movie playing in the background. We weren't planning anything crazy, just a chill night with good people. Sarah was always really into Halloween, so she went all out with the decorations. Fake cobwebs, jack-o'-lanterns, little plastic skeletons scattered everywhere. You know the kind of stuff I'm talking about. The night of the party, people started showing up around 8 o'clock. A few of my friends from work came by, and Sarah invited some of her old college friends. So there was a nice mix of people. Everyone was in costume, which made the night feel festive from the get-go. I dressed up as a zombie. It was easy enough, just some face paint and torn-up clothes. And Sarah went as a witch. People were laughing, drinking, taking selfies with the decorations. It was a fun night, and nothing felt off at first. Then, about an hour into the party, someone knocked on the door. I figured it was just one of our neighbors or maybe a latecomer, so I went to answer it. When I opened the door, there was a guy standing there in costume, a full face mask, the kind that covers the entire head. It was one of those really realistic masks, like a human face but with exaggerated features, almost uncanny. His costume wasn't anything fancy, just a dark hoodie and jeans, but the mask really stood out. I didn't recognize him, but it was a party, and I assumed Sarah must have invited him, or maybe one of my coworkers had brought a plus one. It wasn't a big deal. Halloween parties are supposed to be weird, right? So I just waved him in, figuring he'd find whoever he knew and start mingling. The guy didn't say a word, just walked inside and stood near the wall, kind of hovering around the edges of the room. I thought it was odd, but again, it was Halloween, and some people like to stay in character, so I didn't think too much of it. I made a joke to Sarah about the guy being committed to his costume because he wouldn't even take off the mask, but she just shrugged and said she didn't know who he was either. Still, it didn't seem like anything to worry about at the time. The night went on, and the party was in full swing. We had music going, people were dancing a bit, and we even set up a little drinking game in the corner. Everyone seemed to be having a good time. I noticed the guy in the mask a few more times, just standing around. He didn't really talk to anyone, didn't join in on any of the games or conversations. He was just there, like he was watching the party, but not really part of it. I started to feel a bit uneasy about him. Maybe it was just the mask. It was unsettling. seeing someone so completely covered up like that, especially when everyone else was taking pictures and laughing. I tried to keep an eye on him, but there was so much going on that it was hard to track him in the crowd. He'd be in one corner of the room, and then I'd lose sight of him for a while, only to spot him later near the kitchen or by the balcony. At one point, I noticed my phone wasn't where I'd left it. I'd put it down on the coffee table earlier, but when I went to grab it, it was gone. I figured someone had accidentally picked it up or moved it, but after checking around the room, I couldn't find it. Sarah said hers was missing too, but we didn't panic. We just assumed they'd turn up later. We were in our own place, surrounded by friends, so it didn't feel like a big deal. Things started getting weirder after that, though. One of Sarah's friends, Jess, went to use the bathroom and ended up getting locked inside. She was banging on the door, saying the lock was stuck, and it took us a few minutes to get her out. When we finally did, she looked freaked out but laughed it off, saying it was probably just bad luck with the old door. I wasn't so sure. I'd never had any issues with the bathroom lock before. Then, as the night wore on, more little things started happening. People's drinks went missing, and someone's coat disappeared from the pile in the bedroom where everyone had left their stuff. It wasn't enough to stop the party, but the vibe definitely started to shift. I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling that something was off, and I noticed that the guy in the mask had gone completely silent. He wasn't mingling, wasn't moving around much anymore. He was just standing there in the corner, staring at the rest of us. At this point, I was starting to feel really uncomfortable. I asked around, trying to figure out who had invited him, but no one seemed to know. Everyone thought he was someone else's guest, but as I went from person to person, it became clear that no one had actually brought him. He was just there, and no one remembered seeing him come in with anyone. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that he was probably just a weird friend of a friend, maybe a guy who didn't really know anyone and felt awkward. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Who goes to a Halloween party and doesn't talk to anyone? Who keeps their mask on the entire time, even when they're just standing around? By now, it was getting late, and a few people started heading out. I noticed the masked guy hadn't left yet. He was still standing by the wall, barely moving, just watching as people said their goodbyes. I didn't want to confront him directly. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if I was just letting the creepy mask get to me, but I kept an eye on him. Then, as people trickled out and the crowd thinned, I realized something that made my stomach drop. There was no way this guy could have come in with anyone. He was already in the apartment when the party started. I hadn't seen him come in through the front door. I didn't remember him showing up with anyone. He just appeared at some point, blending into the background. I whispered this to Sarah, trying not to freak her out, but I could tell she was already feeling uneasy too. We both stood there, watching as the last few guests left, wondering what to do about this guy who still hadn't taken off his mask or spoken a single word all night. I wanted to ask him to leave, but something about him made me hesitate. There was a weird tension in the room, like everyone could sense that something was wrong, but no one wanted to be the one to confront him. Finally, it was just me, Sarah, and the masked guy left in the apartment. I turned off the music, hoping it would be a signal that the party was over, but he didn't move. He just stood there by the balcony, still holding that creepy mask over his face. The silence in the room was unbearable. I worked up the nerve to approach him. I didn't know what to say, but I couldn't just let him stand there any longer. I walked over, trying to act casual, and asked him if he was heading out soon. He didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge me. I was starting to get seriously freaked out. I asked him again, more firmly this time, but still nothing. It was like he wasn't even there. Like he was just an empty shell wearing a mask. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel Sarah watching from across the room, just as scared as I was. Before I could say anything else, the masked guy finally moved. He turned his head slightly, looking right at me through the eye holes of the mask. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was considering something. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the door. Sarah and I stood there, frozen, as he reached for the handle and quietly let himself out. The door clicked shut behind him, and just like that, he was gone. We didn't sleep that night. We sat on the couch, wide awake, trying to make sense of what had just happened. We never found out who he was, and our phones never turned up. The next morning, we checked the hallway and the building's security footage, but there was no trace of him. It was like he had never been there. The whole thing still gives me chills when I think about it. I have no idea what that guy's deal was or why he came to our party. But the way he just stood there, silent and watching, still haunts me. Sometimes I wonder if he was casing the place, planning something worse that never happened. Or maybe he was just some guy with a twisted sense of humor. Either way, I hope I never see him again. This happened about 2 years ago when I was working a night shift at a small convenience store in Dayton, Ohio. I don't know if anyone here's familiar with the area, but it's not the worst part of town, though it's definitely not great either. The store I worked at was one of those independent places, not a big chain like 7-Eleven or Speedway. It was a local joint, kind of rundown, and the owner didn't care much about updating anything. The security cameras barely worked, and the locks on the doors had probably been there since the place first opened in the 80s. I had taken the job mainly because it was easy money and the hours fit with my schedule. I was in college at the time, and I needed something flexible that wouldn't interfere with my classes too much. Plus, I figured it would be quiet. No one really came into the store late at night except for the occasional trucker or a few locals grabbing cigarettes or snacks. Most of my shifts were uneventful. I'd sit behind the counter, scrolling through my phone or doing homework, waiting for my shift to end. The store itself was nothing special, just the typical setup. Aisles of snacks, drinks, and basic groceries, along with a few hot food items under a heat lamp near the front. It was the kind of place you'd only stop at if you really needed something in the middle of the night and didn't feel like driving all the way to a bigger store. The weirdness started on a Wednesday night just after midnight. It had been a pretty dead shift so far. I'd had maybe 2 customers in the last couple of hours, and I was getting bored. I remember checking the clock, wishing the night would go faster, when I noticed someone walking into the store. At first, I didn't pay much attention. The person was wearing a hoodie and jeans, nothing unusual, and I figured they'd just grab something and head out like everyone else. But they didn't. They walked over to the snack aisle, stopped for a second, then started pacing slowly up and down the aisles. I watched them for a minute, thinking maybe they were just indecisive, but something about the way they moved seemed off. They weren't really looking at the shelves or picking anything up, just kind of wandering back and forth. It was late, and people act weird sometimes at night, so I didn't think too much of it. I went back to checking my phone, half watching them out of the corner of my eye. After a while, they disappeared behind one of the shelves, and I lost track of them. I figured they were probably just browsing and would check out eventually. A few minutes later, I heard the door chime again. Another person walked in, this time dressed in a weird thrown-together costume, like they had tried to do a last-minute Halloween getup, but didn't put much effort into it. It wasn't Halloween yet, though it was getting close, maybe a week or 2 away. The person went straight to the drinks section, grabbed a soda, and then did the same thing as the first person. Just started walking around the store, not really shopping, just sort of circling the aisles. That's when I started to feel a little uneasy. It wasn't unusual to have a couple of people in the store at night, but they both seemed off. Like they weren't really there to buy anything. More like they were waiting for something or for me to make a move. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then a third person walked in, this one wearing a hoodie pulled low over their face. They didn't grab anything, didn't even pretend to look at the shelves. They just walked straight to the back of the store and stood there. I could see them from behind the counter, just standing at the far end, not moving. At this point, I was starting to get seriously freaked out. I was the only one working the shift, and there was no one else in the store. The cameras might as well have been for decoration since half of them didn't work. And even if they did, they were ancient and grainy. I'd checked them before, and the footage was barely clear enough to see who was in the store, let alone identify anyone if something happened. I glanced up at the clock. It was only 12:30. My shift didn't end for another 4 hours. I tried to focus on anything other than the growing sense of unease. Maybe they were just messing around. Maybe they were planning a prank or something. I wasn't sure, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it in case it was just nothing. After a few more minutes of pacing and wandering, the first guy walked over to the cooler section near the back of the store. I watched him through the little convex mirror mounted in the corner of the ceiling. He stopped, stared at the drinks for a long time, then moved behind one of the shelves again. I lost sight of him, and that's when I realized something strange. I hadn't heard any footsteps. The store had these old linoleum floors that creaked and echoed whenever someone walked around, but there had been no sound at all. It was dead quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerators. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting. People walk quietly sometimes, right? Then the second person, the one in the costume, moved over to the candy aisle, crouching down as if they were looking at something on the bottom shelf. I could still see them from behind the counter, but they weren't really paying attention to the candy. They kept glancing over at me, watching me, but they didn't pick anything up. I pretended to be busy, looking at the register or fiddling with my phone, but I was keeping a close eye on them. A few more minutes passed, and no one came up to the counter. No one bought anything. They were all still in the store, just walking around, circling, disappearing behind shelves, and reappearing in different parts of the store. It was like they were playing some kind of strange game. I stood there trying to look calm, but my stomach was churning. Something wasn't right. I started thinking about what I'd do if one of them tried something. The store had a back exit, but it was through a storeroom filled with boxes, and I wasn't sure how quickly I could get out if I needed to. There was a panic button under the counter, but it was old, and I wasn't even sure if it still worked. I'd never had to use it before. I kept glancing at the clock, willing the night to move faster, but time seemed to crawl by. Every minute felt like an hour. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That 3 people were walking around a convenience store and not buying anything? It wasn't like they were stealing or causing trouble. They were just there, watching. Then, around 1 o'clock, something really strange happened. I went into the back room for a minute to restock the cigarettes, and when I came back out, the store was empty. I didn't hear anyone leave, didn't hear the door chime, but they were all gone. I stood behind the counter for a second, trying to process what had just happened. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. I walked around the store, checking the aisles, but there was no sign of them. The drinks section, the candy aisle, the back of the store, everything was in its place. No one had bought anything, and nothing was missing. I stood there for a minute, wondering if maybe they'd just left quietly while I was in the back. Maybe I hadn't heard the door chime. But then I heard something. A soft shuffle like someone moving quietly just out of sight. It came from the far end of the store near the back. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I had checked that area, but now I wasn't so sure. I walked slowly toward the sound, my shoes squeaking on the linoleum, and I peeked around the corner. No one was there. I stood there for a second, staring down the empty aisle, and then I heard it again. The same soft shuffle, but this time it was coming from the other side of the store near the front. I whipped around, my heart racing, but again there was no one there. At this point I was starting to panic. I walked back to the counter, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I grabbed my phone and started to dial the owner's number. Maybe I was overreacting, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to stay there alone any longer. Just as I was about to hit call, I heard the door chime. I looked up and there was a woman standing in the doorway. She wasn't one of the people who had been in the store earlier, and she looked normal enough, just a regular customer. She smiled at me and walked over to the drinks section, grabbing a soda. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe the weirdos from earlier had left and I was overthinking everything. The woman came up to the counter, paid for her drink, and left. The door chimed as she walked out, and I watched her disappear into the night. And then, just as the door swung shut, I saw them. The three people were standing across the street under a streetlight staring at the store. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. I locked the door and they remained outside for a while before departing. I won't lie, it was quite creepy. 2 years ago, I was a photographer. I was still living in Chicago doing mostly freelance work. During the fall, I'd pick up seasonal gigs like family photo shoots, event photography, and even holiday-themed stuff. I'd been doing it for a while and had built up a decent portfolio, but like anyone in the creative field, I was always looking for new ways to attract clients. That year, I had the idea of offering free Halloween photo shoots. It was a way to get people in the door, build some buzz around my business, and hopefully they'd buy some prints or hire me for future events. I posted a few ads online, in local Facebook groups, and even put up a flyer at the local coffee shop I frequented in Lincoln Park. The concept was simple. Families, couples, or even individuals could come in for a free mini-session, and I'd take a bunch of shots of them in their costumes. It wasn't meant to be too serious, just a fun way to capture the holiday. The photo shoots were scheduled over a weekend with slots for people to come in between noon and 5 p.m. I rented a small space for the sessions, just a basic studio setup with some simple backdrops. Orange, black, and gray tones to give it that Halloween vibe. A few pumpkins, some fake spider webs, that sort of thing. Nothing over the top, but enough to create a festive atmosphere. My studio wasn't huge, but it was cozy, tucked into a quiet part of the neighborhood. It was the kind of spot where most of the clients were locals or people who had heard about me through word of mouth. The first day went pretty well. I had a steady stream of families coming in. Kids dressed up as superheroes, princesses, or little monsters. The parents were usually in costumes too, and everyone seemed to enjoy it. The kids loved the idea of posing in front of the camera, and I got some great shots. I was feeling good about how it was all going, figuring I'd get some good exposure and maybe a few repeat clients down the line. Then, on the second day, things got weird. It was late in the afternoon, around 4:30 p.m., and I was starting to wind down for the day. I had one more family scheduled, and I was honestly looking forward to packing up and heading home. It had been a long weekend, and I was tired. Just as I was adjusting some lighting and getting ready for the next session, the door opened, and a couple walked in with 2 kids. The parents were both wearing matching skeleton costumes, the basic kind you can find at any costume store. They didn't say much when they came in, just nodded in my direction as I greeted them. The kids, though, that's what stood out right away. They were both boys, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing these really creepy old-fashioned masks. I'm talking about the kind of masks you'd see in a vintage Halloween movie from the 1960s or 70s. They had this strange, almost handmade look to them, with exaggerated features like long noses and hollow eyes. The masks weren't your typical cartoon character or superhero get-ups. They were unsettling. The boys were quiet. They stood side by side, holding hands, not saying a word. Usually, kids are either bouncing off the walls or shyly hiding behind their parents when they come in for photos. But these 2 just stood there, perfectly still. It was weird. The parents didn't introduce themselves and I didn't press them. I just figured maybe they were tired or not the chatty type. I set up the shot and told them to gather around the backdrop. The parents moved into position, standing behind the kids, but the boys didn't move. They just stood there, staring straight ahead, their creepy masks fixed in the direction of my camera. I tried to break the ice, asking the kids if they were excited for Halloween, if they liked their costumes. That sort of thing. No response. The parents didn't seem bothered by it, so I just went ahead and started snapping photos. I always take a lot of shots during these sessions. Different angles, close-ups, wide shots, just to make sure I capture the best possible images. I moved around the room trying to get different perspectives, but every time I looked through the lens, those boys were staring directly into the camera. No matter where I moved, their heads seemed to follow me. I chalked it up to the masks. Maybe they had limited vision, so they were just keeping their heads still. But as the session went on, it started to get under my skin. The parents weren't saying much, just standing behind the kids with stiff smiles on their faces, while the boys continued to stare through those eerie, hollow eye holes. When I was done, I thanked them and said I'd send them the proofs within the week. The parents nodded again, still not saying much, and they left with the kids. The whole session couldn't have lasted more than 15 minutes, but it felt like an hour. After they left, I sat down to go through the photos, which is something I usually do after each session. I like to review the shots while they're still fresh in my mind, figure out which ones are the best, and make notes for editing later. That's when things got really unsettling. As I started flipping through the photos, I noticed something odd. In every single shot, the boys were staring directly at the camera. I mean, it wasn't just that they were looking in my general direction. They were staring dead center into the lens, as if they knew exactly where I was standing. It didn't matter if I was crouching low, standing off to the side, or shooting from a different angle. Those blank, hollow eyes were always fixed right on me. At first, I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light or the angle of their masks, but the more I looked, the more it didn't make sense. In one of the shots, I had moved to the far left of the room, practically behind them, and yet they were still staring straight into the camera. There was no way they could have seen me from that angle. I kept scrolling through the images, trying to rationalize it, but the unease in my gut was growing. I even checked the earlier photos I had taken from the other sessions that day, just to make sure it wasn't some weird glitch with the camera. But those photos were fine. The other kids were smiling, looking in different directions, doing normal kid stuff. Everything was normal, except for the photos of the two boys. I couldn't stop thinking about it, but I figured I was just tired. It had been a long weekend, and I was probably reading too much into it. So I saved the files, shut down my computer, and packed up for the night. That should have been the end of it, but things got weirder over the next few days. I had planned to start editing the photos the following Monday, but when I sat down to go through them, something strange happened. As I opened the folder on my computer, the file names for the session with the two boys had changed. Instead of the usual format, the files were labeled with random numbers and letters. At first I thought maybe I'd saved them wrong, or maybe there had been a glitch when I transferred the files from my camera to my laptop. But that didn't explain why all the other sessions were labeled correctly, just the ones from that particular shoot. I tried to open one of the photos to start editing it, but my computer froze. The screen went black for a few seconds, and then the whole thing rebooted. I sat there, staring at the loading screen, feeling that uneasy knot in my stomach again. When my computer finally restarted, I opened the folder again. The files were still there, but now the thumbnails, the little preview images, were all blank. Just empty gray boxes where the photos should have been. I clicked on one of them, and the image opened, but it was distorted. The colors were off, like the brightness had been turned up way too high, and the boys' faces were blurred, almost pixelated. It didn't look like a normal glitch. It looked intentional, like someone had messed with the files. I tried a few more photos, but they were all the same. Distorted, corrupted, the boys' faces twisted and blurry. The parents looked normal in most of the shots, but in a few their faces were obscured too, like they were fading into the background. I'm not a superstitious person, but by that point I was seriously creeped out. I had no explanation for what was happening, and every time I looked at those photos, that uneasy feeling got worse. I thought about emailing the family to tell them something had gone wrong with the files, but I hesitated. I realized I didn't even have their contact information. I usually keep a sign-in sheet at the front of the studio for clients to write down their names, email addresses, and phone numbers. But when I checked the sheet from that day, their names weren't there. I flipped through the pages, thinking maybe I had just missed it, but there was nothing. No record of them at all. That didn't make sense. I remembered them walking in. Remembered the boys standing there in their creepy masks, staring straight ahead. I remembered the parents standing stiffly behind them, but there was no trace of them. No contact info, no payment records, nothing. It was like they had never been there. I deleted the files that night. I didn't want to see those photos again. I told myself it was just a glitch, just a weird, unexplainable fluke. But deep down I knew there was something more to it. Something I didn't want to understand. I never offered free photo shoots again. This happened a couple of years ago when I was living alone in a small rental house in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story house in an older neighborhood that had seen better days. I liked it well enough at first, though. It was quiet, and I'd always been the kind of person who didn't mind being on my own. I'd moved there after a breakup, looking for a fresh start and figuring the small house would be a good place to reset my life. Rent was cheap, and even though the neighborhood was a bit rundown, I felt safe enough. The street was lined with big oak trees, the kind that drop tons of leaves every fall, and the houses around me were a mix of older couples who'd lived there forever and younger families trying to fix up their places. The house itself was nothing special. It had 2 small bedrooms, one of which I used as a home office. There was a small front yard, and a porch with an old screen door that creaked loudly whenever it opened. The backyard was fenced in, but not very well. The wood panels were old and some of the slats were warped. I'd always told myself I'd get around to fixing it up, but I never did. I wasn't exactly handy, and between work and other things, it just kept getting pushed down my to-do list. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone mostly kept to themselves. People would wave if they saw you out front mowing the lawn or bringing in groceries, but no one really talked much beyond that. That was fine by me. I wasn't looking to make friends, just trying to settle in and move on with my life. The incident I'm about to talk about happened right around Halloween. The whole neighborhood had the typical fall decorations out, pumpkins on porches, a few plastic ghosts hanging from trees, and a couple of inflatable yard decorations that seemed to pop up on every block. I had carved a couple of pumpkins myself and set them out on the porch, mostly because I liked the idea of participating in the holiday, even though I wasn't expecting much in the way of trick-or-treaters. The area didn't have a ton of kids, and the few that did live nearby usually went to the fancier neighborhoods where the houses handed out full-size candy bars. It was the weekend before Halloween, maybe a couple of days before the actual holiday. I remember it had been a long day at work, and I had just gotten home from running a few errands. I was tired, looking forward to settling in for the night with some takeout and a movie. It was already dark out, one of those crisp, chilly fall evenings where the air smells like burning leaves, and the wind whistles through the cracks around the windows. I had just finished dinner and was cleaning up when I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was already pretty late. My first thought was that maybe it was a neighbor, but like I said, people didn't usually bother each other around here, especially not at night. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and went to the front door. The porch light was on, casting a dim glow through the frosted glass, so I could make out the outline of someone standing on the other side. When I opened the door, there was a guy standing there holding a stack of pizzas. He looked to be in his mid-20s, wearing a standard pizza delivery uniform, red polo shirt, baseball cap, that sort of thing. He smiled kind of awkwardly and said he had my delivery. Here's the thing. I hadn't ordered any pizza. I hadn't ordered anything, actually. I remember just standing there, confused for a second before telling him he had the wrong address. He double-checked the receipt he had in his hand, and sure enough, it had my address printed right there, clear as day. I told him again, politely but firmly, that I hadn't ordered anything, and that he must have gotten the wrong house. He apologized and seemed genuinely confused. He stood there for a second, looking at the receipt, as if he was trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Finally, he shrugged, gave me another awkward smile, and said he'd have to go back to the restaurant to sort it out. I watched as he walked back down the driveway to his car, an old beat-up sedan with a pizza place sign stuck to the roof. After he left, I didn't think too much about it. It was a weird mix-up, sure, but things like that happen sometimes. Maybe someone had given the wrong address when they placed the order, or maybe it was a mistake in the system. Either way, it wasn't my problem. So I locked the door and went back to cleaning up. About an hour later, I was sitting on the couch, half watching some random horror movie on TV, when I heard another knock at the door. This time, it was softer, less hurried. I paused the movie and listened for a second, trying to decide if I had imagined it. When the knock came again, I got up, feeling a slight sense of unease creeping in. It wasn't like me to get spooked easily, but something about the timing of it felt off. I went to the front door again and looked through the peephole. The porch was dark now, and for a second I didn't see anyone. Then I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The same pizza guy was standing there, only this time he wasn't holding any pizzas. He was just standing there, his hands hanging loosely by his sides, looking straight ahead. I didn't open the door right away. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. Why would he be back? Maybe he had gotten the address wrong again. Or maybe there was some other mix-up with the order. But it didn't explain why he wasn't holding anything. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to open the door or just ignore him. Before I could make up my mind, he knocked again, a little louder this time. I stepped back from the door, my heart starting to race. The guy didn't look aggressive or anything, but there was something about the way he stood there so still that made my skin crawl. I reached for my phone, thinking I'd call the pizza place to figure out what was going on, but before I could, I heard the faint sound of the door handle turning. He was trying to open the door. I froze, my mind going blank for a second. Then instinct kicked in, and I bolted toward the door, locking the deadbolt just as I heard the handle jiggle again. My heart was pounding in my ears as I stood there, pressing my back against the door, listening for any sound on the other side. There was nothing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for him to knock again or say something, but the silence stretched on. Finally, I worked up the nerve to look through the peephole again. The porch was empty. The guy was gone. I waited a few more minutes before finally stepping away from the door, my hands still shaking. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call the police, but what would I even say? That a pizza guy had come to the wrong house twice and then tried the door handle? It wasn't exactly an emergency, and I figured by the time anyone got here, he'd be long gone. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every little sound. I kept checking the windows, making sure they were locked, and I double-checked the back door to make sure it was secure. I tried to go back to watching TV, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying the way the guy had stood there, so still, his hands hanging at his sides like he wasn't delivering pizza anymore, like he was waiting for something else. The next morning, I called the pizza place to ask if they had sent anyone to my address the night before. The girl who answered the phone seemed confused and told me that they hadn't had any deliveries in my area. I pressed her, asking if there had been any mix-ups or if anyone had reported a problem, but she insisted that there hadn't been. According to their records, no one had been sent to my house at all. I hung up, feeling a sick pit in my stomach. If the pizza guy hadn't been sent by the restaurant, then who was he? And why had he come to my house twice, claiming to have an order that didn't exist? I didn't get much sleep for the next few nights. Every time I heard a creak or a knock, my mind would race back to that moment when I saw him standing on the porch, trying the door handle. I started locking the doors earlier in the evening, and I kept my phone by my side at all times, just in case. I never saw him again after that night, but I never really felt safe in that house again either. The locks never seemed strong enough, the windows too thin, the walls too hollow. Eventually, I moved out, telling myself it was time for a change, but the truth is, I just didn't want to be there anymore. Even now, I still think about it sometimes, about the guy standing on my porch with those pizzas that weren't mine, and the way he had tried the door handle like he was testing it. I'll never know who he was or what he wanted, and maybe that's the part that haunts me the most.